Following on our discussion we had last week, I thought long and hard as to what would be an appropriate lesson. Many people have this year embraced Christ Jesus through baptism. And it's such an incredible event, and many of you I've spoken to this week have decided you want to be baptized, and so we will finalize that after we've had intense discussions. But there is something I want to speak about this morning that is so critical. And that is the idea that once you have made that decision to live a life that intentionally goes the direction that God wants you and I to go. And so this morning's topic is no turning back. I love that song, and I remember it's as if I'm hearing Des sing it. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. The cross before me, the world behind me. And that kind of dedication and singing that echoes and reminds us of just moving forward is crucial in the life of the Christian. I may have shared with you Hernan Cortés. In 1519, he was a Spanish explorer coming to South America, in fact to Mexico. And with him he had about 600 men in the Armada as they were trying to take over the Aztec Empire. 2 missions before that had failed. And he decided as the captain that they would not fail a third time. And so the question came, and was the discussion of much research, as what actually happened that made Cortés so successful. The task was difficult, it was complex, it was dangerous. The loss of men and lives is a reality. And so from all of these things, the mission was going to be tough. But Cortés decided that there is something in the psyche of his soldiers that he needed to sort out very quickly. He had them offload the boats with all their provisions, and then he decided that the boats would be dismantled and in fact set on the shore. Some people say that he had burned the boats, but many historians differ on that and said that they were taken apart. I want you to imagine being the soldier that is now going to be moving on land against a formidable enemy. But indeed you find that your captain said the very thing that could help you in the event that problems could be insurmountable, that you could turn back and run, was now not possible anymore. The idea of always going forward resonates in the heart of every Christian. At this time, I want us to watch a clip which is going to be the background for our lesson this morning out of 1 Kings chapter 19.
The books of 1st and 2nd Kings, although they're 2 separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focus on Jerusalem. First with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here, because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel. And he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple than he makes some really horrible choices, and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20. And then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. And the most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both built altars and prayed to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elijah. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so, God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door. Or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it. He's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the book of Kings.
A phenomenal book, and inside of this wonderful 1st and 2nd Kings, you find the encounter of two individuals. The one is Elijah, a guy that we have so much respect for. In fact, on Mount Carmel, in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 21, he stood and spoke to the people of God, and he says, "How long will you falter between these two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." And it's in the footsteps of such a brave guy who had killed all the Baal prophets, we find that in walks a man by the name of Elisha. What a phenomenal example he had in this man. He stood head above any other prophet of his time. He also faced King Ahab. And the idea is that being a prophet of God is not easy. You would find that he had to face so many challenges, and one of them were being threatened to be killed by Jezebel. We find that this man, all the way through his history, had had an incredible run of opposition, but yet remained faithful to God. When we speak about Elijah, he probably would come across as a man that is unkempt, not very tidy, very battle-weary, and in he walks, and into the focus of this new scene, in walks Elisha. We find that Elisha had been part of a very, very wealthy family. Elisha, in 1 Kings 19, verse 1, they speak that Elijah found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who has plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him. It's very interesting to find that his parents or family owned 12 yoke of oxen, which made them an extremely wealthy family at that time. It was definitely a good time to start plowing. We know that 3.5 years of drought had been predicted by Elijah, and it definitely occurred. And yet also, they then eventually got some rain. And so we find that he is great at the cusp of prosperity and greatness. In walks Elijah, and he approaches Elisha. We find that he has his hands full of being a farmer. Plowing as well as he was doing, he gets approached by Elijah. You and I that come from farming backgrounds know that work never ends. And many of you that have got your own companies and businesses know that work never ends. There is always something to be done. You finish one thing and something else pops up. But one of the key things I want us to see is that the man that's approached is a farmer. In other words, he was very busy. His day started early, it ended late, and he must have been exhausted. But God approaches him to take over from Elijah. When you read through the scriptures, you start to realize that God has got an uncanny way of approaching people to serve him. And many times those are busy people, people that are hard at the task of their jobs, faithfully executing not only what the expectations are from their employer or as from the employer or as a person who owns their own company. They drive the system without being supervised. They are the people that have got initiative, people that are busy. And it's within this busyness that he is called. It's been said that lazy men do not apply for this kind of job. In fact, that God does not call lazy people. He called Elijah, somebody who was busy with something that was important to his family. We note that this is not often the case as a coincidence, but in fact that it is endemic or emblematic of how God deals with people and how he calls them. We know for a fact that Moses, being called by God, he was tending sheep out in the desert. Gideon was busy on the threshing floor. David, where was he? Samuel was looking for him, but he was out there tending to the sheep in the field. We also find that Peter and Andrew, when called by Jesus, they were busy fishing. And within the environment of their work, they were called and said to follow me. When Jesus called Matthew, he was working for SARS in Matthew 9. Jesus calls busy people to fulfill his promise. You see, Jesus didn't go down searching people for the sake of it. But he was looking for people specifically that wanted to realign the purpose in their life. People that look beyond the mundane tasks that they've come to master in their world and say, I've got something better for you. I've got something far greater for you. Beyond the monotony of getting up in the morning, executing your job and going home. A friend of mine, Mr. Clive Goss, I think he passed away now. He was a wonderful man. I was a young teenager at the time working at Checkers. And he called me and he said, my boy, be careful. You're developing tunnel vision. And I said, what do you mean? And he said to me, be careful that you literally get up at the same time, go to work the same way, come home the same way, climb into your bed the same way. And at the end of the day, you're just like a rat going and coming. I thought that was an interesting analogy. But when I look at it, I often ask the question, is that maybe what we are doing inadvertently? I was wondering to myself as I was preparing the lesson with Elisha plowing the fields. And the story goes that he was in the 12th team that was busy plowing. In other words, he was probably in charge of the entire plowing, but he was standing at the back watching how the other guys were doing their job. And the monotony of all of this must have been incredibly invasive on his mind. And he probably asked himself the question, well, what's there to plowing? Up and down the same furrows, and there's nothing much to life. And so I would imagine he would have asked himself those hard questions. Is this all that life has for me? And maybe you as a student today are going through some similar thoughts. You're probably asking the question, I want to do something meaningful. Is my entire life now geared to studying, getting up in the morning, going to class, taking notes, coming back, making summaries, then trying to draw up study notes and work on resources and sources and even on assignments? Is that the task for the rest of my life? Or is there something that God has far more meaningful for me? Elisha must have been one of those guys. But one of the things that becomes abundantly clear is that Elisha was faithful in his task. He was dedicated to what needed to be done. And sometimes faithful monotony leads you to want to look for Jesus Christ and something greater in your life. Something happened out in the field, and Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle on him. Elijah walked up, took off his cloak, and walked away. Took off his cloak, put it on Elisha, and walked away. Now, I'm not trying to think that maybe you and I, looking at that, would say, hang on a minute, isn't there a coat hanger somewhere or a tree that you could put this on, or even on the ox cart? Not on me, thank you. But here's the key about that. The idea of a cloak being hung on somebody else is passing on a mantle of authority, a mantle of responsibility. It's like an orchestral leader passing on the baton to his successor. I remember in grade 9, we, as English students at a school, we had an incredible English teacher who was a lecturer at UCT, and he taught us how to listen to musical appreciation. I still remember the music we listened to was by some guy by the name of Karajan. Now, we listened to this song about 20 times to eventually try to pick up what the rhythm was, but I would imagine that somebody with such fame would be able to pass on his baton to somebody and say, I want you to take over from me. In the same way, we see this wonderful thing being displayed on athletic stages. The life was hard on the mountains, but we find that he gets his job from Elijah. I wonder what he probably asked. Excuse me, I'm coming now to follow you. What would the perks be of this job? In looking up for illustrations, I found out that there was a group called the Californian Conservation Tour, It's an environmental group of young men between 18 and 25, and they are asked to commit 1 year of their lives to work outdoors and to respond to emergencies as wildfires and earthquakes. I want you to listen very carefully. In volunteering, they would then obviously would ask what would we get in return, and this is the standard answer: hard work, low pay, miserable conditions, and more. Ethan, does that ring a bell with you? Ethan is a firefighter, by the way, and when you and I are in our homes and we hear about these fires, this cat is right behind there, knocking them out, 6 love. So when we talk about that, hard work, low pay, miserable conditions, and more, verse 20, we find that his response is the following. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, please let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you. What an incredible way of making a decision on the spur of the moment and saying, I'm ready. I would imagine that they would have known a lot about Elijah. Elijah's fame would have been all over town, and everybody would have known about him, especially about the fight that he had with the Baal prophets. His response was immediate. But I want you to look also at what he did. He went to say goodbye to his parents. You see, in Luke chapter 9, verse 61, is the same kind of thinking. When people were called by Jesus Christ, they said, Lord, I will follow you. But first let me go and bid farewell who are at my house. Saying goodbye was not just an excuse, but it was a matter of respect. And we find that this man, right in the beginning of this text, that is loaded with content, we start to pick up the kind of character that we are dealing with as a prophet now being groomed by Elijah. What a wonderful thing to be able to be called by God. We find in the calling of Peter and Andrew, it was very interesting. When Jesus called them, they left their nets and followed Christ. In the same way with Matthew, he was working at SARS here in Bellville. He was sitting and doing his work and consulting with Richard. And the next best thing, when Jesus came along and said, hey, by the way, don't you want to follow me? He said, sure, I'm out of here. Goodbye, guys. I'll see you later. You see, Jesus stated also for his apostles that left everything that spoke to him and had the same kind of question. See, we have left all and followed you. Peter wasn't boasting, he was merely speaking the truth. He had left everything for Jesus Christ, his family, his job, his home. There was nothing to go back to. And he asked Jesus, listen, what is in it for me? I want to talk about somebody I mentioned in Bible study. I sat with an elder about 2 or 3 years ago, and I was talking with Jim. I want you to imagine an elder has got a lot of beard. He's got dungarees, by the way, absolutely sporting looking, but an incredible man, godly man. And we were sitting out and just talking. And Jim said to me, I want to show you something. I said, sure. Now, let me say this. When people say, I want to show you something, in my mind, I've got things like guns and that kind of thing in mind. He went to his study and he fetched me a Bible. I've never in my life seen a Bible so ruined. I looked at this Bible, and the Bible was written in every single page in red and blue ink. I said, wow, that's quite a bit of hard reading. And he explained to me that this man that wrote this, that this Bible belonged to, he was a drug lord in California. He was baptized into Christ, moved to Florence, Alabama, and he met him, spent time with him. He literally, when Jesus Christ called him, he left everything behind, his entire drug empire, and he followed Jesus. Once a year, he would ask Jim because he had nothing. He had nothing. He took his mother and he moved to a quiet little town, and that's where he lived. He did hard work, labor on the sideline because he realized that extorting money and making money off the backs of hardworking people is not the way that you go. Dealing in death is not the way that you must go. And so what he did was he lived a life where once a year he would ask Jim to buy him a Bible, and he would work through that one Bible per year because that's all that Bible could handle. You see, when you look at Elisha, look at what he did. He takes the 12, he takes the yoke of oxen that he was busy with, slaughtered them, boiled their flesh, using the oxen's equipment, and gave it to the people, and they ate. And so he arose and followed Elijah. He had a braai and said, hey, boys, pull in. No problem. I want you to grasp the impact of what he had done. He's literally given up on everything. His income, his sustained business, and also on the family. It reminds me of Cortez, who got rid of his ships. Elijah burned his plow and oxen. There was no turning back. You see, he understood that when a man of God had called you to serve God in his place, that your reliance and dependence on God must be complete. He didn't ask his family, by the way, please keep a spare room open just in case this new gig doesn't work. Because that's often the case with us. We try to secure ourselves. You see, Jesus makes a comment in Luke chapter 9, verse 62. And it's interesting that he would use the metaphor of a plow. Listen to what he says. No one, having put his hand to the plow and looking back, is fit for the kingdom of God. I want you to sink into your mind and also find passages as we are working through this where God would say that the only way that you can follow me is trusting me wholeheartedly with every fiber of your being. There is no other way. And when you follow me and you look back at an alternative or making sure that your back is covered, you are following the wrong God. You see, what Elisha understood, I'm going to follow God regardless. I'm going to follow his call no matter what happens. I'm not going back. The old life is over forever. I've got a new purpose in life, and there is no ways that I'm going to even make provision for a door in the background. You don't have to understand fully before you obey immediately. Elisha had absolutely no idea what lay ahead of him. Remember, all the stories that he would have understood about how Elijah's life went was completely anecdotal. He never knew what was going on. He never experienced that. He's only heard about that. But you see, now he was going to go into an environment where he would feel the stress of standing up against ungodly people, especially in the environment of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, people that are bent on idolatry. But he made one point and one thing clear, that when God says, follow me, he said, I will do that. Whatever opportunities God makes available, he would take them. And that's why when he speaks about Abraham, he says in Hebrews 11 verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called out to a place which he did not know where he was going. I want to touch on something that you might not know and probably never will have access to. Something bothered me in the sermon that I preached the other day. It really bothered me. Because sometimes I would sit quietly and I'm busy working in the garden, or I'm maybe working on something in the shed, and something will bother me. And then I was reading and listening to a clip of a guy who said that, have you ever thought what Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1 meant? And then he said it actually does not mean go up from here to there, but it means go for yourself, toward yourself, or even could be translated in the Hebrew of one of becoming. I did some further research on this text in the Hebrew, and it became abundantly clear that right in the inception of the Bible, God already was talking about a transformation model which speaks of you moving out from your own comfort zone into discomfort where God lies, that he becomes your all in all and nothing else matters. I was sitting in the car this morning and Sue and I were driving, and I said, I've never in my life seen that even in Luke chapter 15, talking about the prodigal son. It seems that it's a reversal of what we're talking about in Abraham, where the son was sitting next to the pig pen and he was eating the stuff that the pigs ate. Eventually, he came to himself. The idea of introspection becomes so important. So when I read the text again, I thought, hang on, this is not about movement to location, but the idea of finding a new me in the will of God. That's what this text is all about. In other words, when you and I are where we are in a sinful world, in a sinful life, God is saying, I want you to step out of that comfort zone, that whole world of adaptation and sinful behavior, and find a new you in me. Passages out of James jumped out at me speaking about Scripture. When you look at the Scriptures, he's saying that you look at it as into a mirror. The idea of self-reflection becomes so important. From your land, he speaks about mostly the idea of leaving that behind which you are familiar with. Theologically, it means the idea of a sign of stepping into a covenant with God. A relationship covenant means a severance of attachment to this world, that nothing else matters. You cannot threaten a man that follows God to push him into vulnerability. You cannot make her feel insecure by trying to cut away friends away from her. Why? Because they have answered the call of God. And when God calls, he will make sure that you're okay. Romans chapter 10 sprung into my mind this morning as I was talking with Sue, that he said, he who has called you is faithful, and he who has called you will do this. He will sustain you regardless. I started to look at things in this text, which started off as a simple exposition of following God, trusting God. Suddenly I found the Bible just jumping out at me and saying, yes, God is more. The second place I want to touch on, those God uses the most are those who holds onto the least. You see, brethren, so many times you and I have gaga blankets. We have gaga blankets, and those are our investments to kind of say, well, I'm cool, I've got this. If anything happens, nobody can touch me. I'm secure. God is saying, you let go of your gaga blanket, and I'm the only one that sustains you. You see, brethren, when David, as a young man in Psalms chapter 23, makes the comment, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, he was talking within the context of Saul persecuting him, wanting to kill him. A man that had evil intent in the life. And David said, you know what, there is no question about this, that God will sustain me. Leave your land, relatives, father's home, and go to a land I will show you. When you answer the calling of God, there is no going back. There is no going back. And so my plea to you this morning is, as we go into this day, as you walk with God this year, as you walk with God this new month, that in your mind there'll be one simple phrase in your heart: no turning back. No turning back. Because what I'm turning back to is rubbish. Like Paul would say, it's feces. Let's stand and sing our song of encouragement as we close.